Yeah. Should I start that again? Hi, I'm Mike Edgerton. I'm directing the Artistic Research Program in Music at the Malmö Academy of Music at Lund University. Thank you for coming. This is our third event of the Interferal Arts Festival. We're doing two things tonight. We're going to do a panel discussion with John Weisend, who is a scientist at ESS, the European Spallation Source. Myself with Olaf Tzschoppe and Karin Johansson, who will say a few words. She's our director of music. So give her a hand. Yeah.
Hello, nice to see you here. So I'm Karin Johansson. I'm the rector and prefect of Malmö Academy of Music at the moment. And I'm very happy to be part of this event tonight. For many reasons. We have had the Faculty of Fine and Performing Arts for a little more than 10 years by now. And so, as you maybe know, we have the research disciplines of music education, art, and theater. And this discipline, which we're focusing on in this festival, you could say, is the artistic research in music, for the most part. And I'm very happy that Mike has organized and conceptualized all these events. And also, which is one thing for the future to be very excited about, I think, the cooperation which we will hear about tonight. And I think there are many possibilities for the arts to collaborate and cooperate with other disciplines in our university and, of course, elsewhere. I think that is it. So just very happy to be here and welcome.
So I mentioned briefly that John Weisend from ESS will open up our panel discussion by introducing you all to what's happening at ESS and some issues involving that.
Great, thank you.
So thank you, John.
Thank you, Mike. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be involved in this collaboration. Mike and I have been working together for more than a year on this work. And what I wanted to do briefly before we have the panel discussion is just give a brief overview of what the European Spallation Source is, and also talk a little bit about superfluid helium, which is the technology that sort of inspired Mike's composition. And he'll talk more about that during the panel as well. But let's start with the European Spallation Source. So this is a big science project being built here in Lund. It started here in Lund officially in 2014. We broke ground. And the goal of the ESS is to provide neutrons, which are a subatomic particle that we use for imaging materials. And we will be a spallation-based neutron source, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. But the whole point is to be a very bright source, to have large amounts of neutrons at the right energies that allow us to do fundamental research in material science, chemistry, physics, drug development, and so on. So we are basically a research facility for scientists to come in as users to use our neutron beams to make fundamental discoveries. And we're going to be much brighter than the existing neutron sources out there, and we're going to wind up replacing a number of smaller European sources, mainly reactor-based sources, as they start to shut down. We will be a world-class research facility, and we expect to be a strong addition to the intellectual environment that is Lund. And one of the reasons we're in Lund is exactly because there's such a strong research and intellectual environment here already, and we're going to add to that. We're a European project. We're not funded by the European Union, but rather we're funded by collaborative agreements with a number of European countries. You can see their flags here on the screen. The host countries of Sweden and Denmark, our data center is located down in Copenhagen. They provide, during construction, about half the construction costs, and then during operations, about 15% of the operation costs. And the remaining non-host countries provide the other 50% of the construction costs, and then most of the operations costs. Now, the difference here is that Sweden and Denmark provide their contribution mostly in cash, directly payments that pay for the building of the physical structures, the buildings, the salaries of the staff, the procurements that we buy of things that we buy. Our non-host countries, our member states, they provide most of their contributions in what we call in kind, where they will actually provide a piece of equipment that makes up the accelerator or makes up one of the science experiments or makes up one of the target. So here's what ESS looks like, and I'll show you a picture towards the end of this talk about where we are, but essentially we are a linear accelerator. So we will accelerate protons, another subnuclear particle, down a long, about 400-meter long accelerator buried in the ground. Those protons will go up and be accelerated up to 2 GeV, which is a fairly high energy. They will then strike a tungsten target, and when they hit this tungsten target, that causes the target to emit neutrons. Those neutrons then go out to a variety of instruments arranged around the target itself. And it's in those instruments that the actual science takes place. To give you an example of the in-kind contributions, this is a chart showing the various parts of the accelerator, and I'm not going to give a lecture on accelerator physics today, but the blue parts are superconducting. They operate at very low temperatures, which is where the superfluid helium comes in. But you can also see here the logos of all the various organizations that provide components to the accelerator. So almost everything in the beamline of the accelerator, this 400-meter accelerating structure, are provided as in-kind contributions from Spain, Italy, France, Germany, and other countries throughout Europe. And that's their contribution to this project. They also contribute very heavily to the target and all the instruments as well. This is what it looks like now. So this is almost completely done. We expect to finish civil construction this year. We've actually started to operate part of the accelerator down at the low energy end. Here's the low energy part of the accelerator. It's buried underground for shielding purposes. The protons come out, they strike the target in the middle of this building, and then you can see there are going to be instruments in these side and also this far instrumentation hall. You can see our new offices that we've just moved into, and then some auxiliary buildings for services such as cryogenics and power. So in addition to our in-kind contributors that help fund the project and provide equipment to help build the project up, we also collaborate with many, many institutions. And that's part of why I'm here today. We collaborate with Lund University. A number of staff, including myself, have adjunct appointments in various departments at Lund University in engineering, physics, chemistry, et cetera. And that's to allow us to do teaching, to do writing, to do research that's not directly related to ESS, but more broadly related to our technical fields. We have a ongoing, since more than a year ago, an ongoing collaboration with the Malmö Academy of Music and the Inner Arts Center. That's part of how this work came about. We also collaborate with MAX4, the large light source, which is next to us. It's an X-ray source. We collaborate with CERN, which is the very large High-energy physics machine down in Geneva. We work with regional industry via the CAT Pro project and via the organization known as Big Science Sweden. We collaborate with foreign institutions like the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the Indian Institute of Technology, Eurofusion, the Mura project, which is an accelerator being built in Belgium. And the reason we do this is that experience shows in big science projects that, and particularly CERN's a very good example of this, but they show that these collaborations, both scientific and cultural, tend to lead to innovations. It helps us recruit staff because we're always doing interesting things. We have an interesting intellectual environment. And it bolsters the research environment of the region. So these sorts of connections of ourselves to other institutions, including arts institutions, is part of making ESS a world-class research facility, and it's something we devote some time to and take very seriously. So I want to switch gears now and talk a bit about helium-2, because this is the material that has inspired Mike's composition. Helium-2 is the second liquid phase of the most common isotope of helium. So if you go and get a tank of helium, say to blow balloons or something, and you cool it down, if you get it down to 4.2 Kelvin, it becomes a liquid at room pressure. If you cool it further to about 2.17 Kelvin, which is 271 degrees below 0 Celsius, it transitions to yet another liquid phase, and that we call helium-2. And helium-2 is very fascinating. It's a rare macroscopic occurrence, a manifestation of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is a basic theory that explains a lot of how the world works, but generally its effects, its direct effects, are seen only microscopically. Now, it may develop technology such as semiconductors that we see macroscopically, and we all have cell phones because we understand how quantum mechanics works. But helium-2 is an example where you actually, at a macroscopic level, looking at a flow of fluid, actually can see quantum mechanics in action. And the way this works is in helium-2, a fraction of the helium atoms have condensed into what we call the quantum ground state, the lowest energy state. And some of the others have stayed up in the more excited states. And the quantum ground state we call the superfluid component, and it has no viscosity, can flow without resistance. And the normal fluid component, the stuff that's in the excited state, is more like a normal fluid. It's more like water or regular helium, if you will. The variation between these fractions of normal and superfluid component change as a function of temperature, and their interaction, their presence and their interactions, leads to very interesting and technically useful applications of helium-2. It is a very efficient heat transfer mechanism. It moves heat very efficiently, which is important when we're trying to cool things. It has frictionless flow through small capillaries. It can flow up, have film flow up container walls. I'll show you in a schematic of that. It has second sound, which I'll talk about briefly. And it has quantized vortices, where the rotation in the helium itself, in the helium-2 itself, is actually a quantum phenomenon as well. So it's a very unique fluid for both fundamental physics understanding, but the real reason we use it at ESS and at many other labs is it's a very useful thing. So we use helium-2 to cool our superconducting RF cavities. These are the cavities that accelerate the beam by putting RF energy into the beam. And they perform much better at lower temperatures. They have to be below about 9 Kelvin to be superconducting at all, but if you get them down to 2 Kelvin, their performance, they're much more efficient, and so we lose a lot less energy. And that's important to us because we want to have an energy-efficient accelerator. In addition, because of the very high heat transfer of helium-2, it also helps in the way the cavities work and in their performance. Helium-2 is an enabling technology in many accelerator-based big science projects. It's used down at CERN. It's what cools the CERN accelerator there. And it's used in many, many other linear accelerators that apply superconducting RF. So there's probably more than a dozen projects worldwide using tons of this very unique quantum fluid, and we're one of them. And you can see sort of at the bottom here an example of our cryo modules. You can see the elliptical cavities in the orange, and then surrounding that is a bath of this helium-2. So in addition to being useful technically, it has some interesting physical phenomenon that I'd mentioned. One is quantized vortices, and you can see that on the left-hand side of this figure. And what this is showing is a visualization of little tiny vortices in a rotating bucket of helium-2. And as you go from A to L, the speed of the bucket is increasing, and the number of vortices that you can see in the liquid, this is done by trapping electrons in the vortices, and then imaging that, increase. And you can see they're discrete. The other thing is this film flow phenomenon, and you can see that shown here, where if we have helium-2 and we put a container in it, helium-2 will actually flow up the lip walls of the container and fill the container until the liquid on the inside and the liquid on the outside are at the same level. That won't happen with other liquids. Water or any other liquid will not do that because it's going against the force of gravity. But there is a mechanism in helium-2 that causes that to happen. And the opposite happens if you start to pull the container out. It will actually drain, again going against the force of gravity, until the levels are equivalent. Possibly the most interesting thing that it does, and this is one of the things that Mike has used as part of his composition, is the idea of second sound. So in first sound, or what we call sound, what you'll hear tonight by the percussion group, that's pressure waves, right? And we have an alternating pressure wave. And all medium will do that. In helium-2, it's possible to develop a temperature wave, and that comes about because you can, in the high temperature areas, you can have more of the normal conducting component, and in the low temperature areas, more of the superfluid component. And by doing that, and you do that by driving a heat pulse through it, that will allow you to set up these temperature waves. And second sound is very useful. It's one of the other features of helium-2 is that these two components, the normal fluid component and the superfluid component, interact with each other, and they have that interaction is known as mutual friction, and Mike has picked this up as part of his inspiration as well. And you can study that amount of mutual friction by second sound, and you can make some fundamental measurements of turbulence, which is a very difficult physical problem to understand at a fundamental level, and helium-2 is a nice mechanism for doing that. And we've also more recently been using it to use it as a diagnostic on some of our SRF cavities. I think that's my last slide. Yes, it is. So hopefully that gives you a nice introduction, at least a sense of what we're doing at ESS, and a sense of the physical phenomenon behind the collaboration that Mike and I have done for his composition. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Great. Well, thank you, John. I thought perhaps it would be of interest if we would have a small discussion about some of these issues and invite Olaf, the director of the percussion ensemble, and Karin to join us and see where we go.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, and by the way, we've published 2 papers. They're popular science, so not technical science. I'm not a scientist. And I've made a few copies. If anybody's interested, you can have them now or later or not. So just let me know. Okay. This is the piece I composed, and yeah.
I can just hand it out.
Absolutely, yeah. This is the piece I composed in response to what John and I discussed, der Rufer. This is a statue in Bremen. And do you have any comments about, for instance, here we have the second sound, this mutual friction type of idea. I'm not really sure where I'm going with this. So one thing that we did in this piece is in order to try to make a difference for the general audience was that I wanted to, for the percussion instruments, to have an iterative instrument, like usually you hit a drum. I wanted to sustain the sounds in some ways. So what we were in Bremen playing around, like kids, I guess.
Oh, I call that doing some research and looking up for possibilities.
That's it too. Yeah. So and we were playing around with the small handheld cymbals, and I really wanted to try to get into the nature of sustained sounds, thinking of bowed instruments, for instance. So we tried with a drumstick to bow a cymbal. and it didn't work. So he was holding the cymbal. Would you like to get a handheld cymbal? And it totally did not work. Oh. Oh, it's over there. Okay. So, yes. But I think at first we tried the drumstick, right? I forget.
I forget. We tried
So,
different things, and so we have a cymbal. And the biggest issue for most of the composers is, well, if they work for percussion, we can beat the instruments and we have the attack, and that's it. Sometimes we have a decay, but to make a continuous sound, we can make a roll, which is a high frequency of attacks, and then still we have the decay. But it's hard to have an instrument which is really sounding all the way through, or to have it sustained just like an organ where we hit a note and then it sounds as long as we push the key.
Yeah.
We have one instrument where it's working quite well. This would be, for example, a crotale. I could go on forever since I'm tired, but otherwise it's maybe tricky. Yeah. On the cymbal we have a different effect when we do this, because we could say that's nice, but maybe not the most interesting sound, especially not in what he was looking for.
Right.
And so then we came...
Particularly because we have the change of the up and down bow.
Right.
So you don't really have a sustained sound.
And so we came up with the idea that what else can we do? And one way is to take a drumstick and then we just...
And the interesting thing about this is that the vibrations don't stop. It's like the string. When you're bowing a string, you have something called self-sustained oscillations where it continues to vibrate even though you're changing direction, whereas this did not. But when he's rubbing in a circle, it continues to vibrate the instrument, and you get very interesting results, jumping to different modes all the time.
Yeah.
But it's possible to produce also a very pure tone, is that correct?
Yeah, there's always a little bit chance involved in these kind of things, but
yeah.
So
good. So,
so it's hard just for a composer to say, well, you have to play this G, whatever, G5, and then play it in the next concert, and always the same. So this we should avoid. Yeah. But otherwise, getting the idea of a clear pitch, what I was doing before, that's possible.
Yeah. And the nice thing about this is you get very pure tones, but also you get very rough tones as well. So there's a variety of different outputs that are possible with this thing. Now, the interesting thing for this project for me, and for the idea of second sound, was that I wanted to have this idea of mutual friction. And that's why it was important that we could have very pure tones and very rough tones, because sometimes you have pure tones and sometimes you have rough tones in the percussion ensemble. And this may not make sense if you can't see it very closely, but can you see the music at all, or not really? So, okay, I'll just explain it to you. So what we have here is we have circles with some arrows in it, and those indicate that he's rubbing on the cymbal, making sounds. And then we have different iterative, noisy types of things happening around it. And for me, that was kind of a very loose metaphor for this idea of mutual friction. And so the rubbing of the cymbal would begin with a pure tone and then later become rougher and more noisy. as a result of the interactions with the rest of the players. So that kind of in a way worked to promote this idea of mutual friction.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I would be interested in the process between you too. Did you discuss, or did you in any way change the direction when you? Yeah.
Well, so I know absolutely nothing about musical composition, I'm afraid, which may have been an advantage. But well, the way the collaboration worked was, Mike and I had actually met at a Swedish class at Lund University and got to talking and decided to work together on this. And he came to ESS and we gave him a tour and I explained the cryogenic system and then I provided him with a variety of popular science articles about helium-2, which describes second sound and mutual friction. And then he would come back and ask questions and we would talk about it and I would try to explain it in a way that we could both understand, and so it was collaborative in that sense. He didn't come back and say, I'm using a G, should it be a G? I mean, that I wouldn't have been able to add any value to that. Yeah. But I will observe there's an interesting comment that Olaf made that, a composer will say, I need you to play this same note at each concert, and practically that can be very difficult to do. We see a similar dynamic in science where a physicist will come to engineers such as myself and say, I want to do this. I know it doesn't violate the laws of physics, so it should be possible, and this is what we need to do in order to do the research. And we will frequently look at it and say, well, practically that's either not really possible, or it's too expensive, or it takes too long. And then we will work collaboratively with the physicists to try to get the same sort of effect that he's looking for in a way that is possible with today's technology. And in some cases, we will push today's technology to meet the physicist's needs to the extent that we can, and we've done that at ESS. And in other cases, we'll say that's simply not a practical thing, but there's an alternative approach we can use that will get you the same results. So that sort of collaboration between the theoretical and the practical we see this in science projects all the time. It's a major point, and it's a nice analog, but
that's exactly what I was doing with him.
Yeah, that's exactly
when he
what
was
we're doing.
asking for certain things. This is exactly when I said, I get the idea, we can try, but don't expect me to have it all the time, and so we can replace it by some things. So we have to be a little bit open for that.
Yeah, and we had a very interesting example of one very unique occurrence. Usually on the vibraphone or marimba, we all know that you play a harmonic, right? Everybody probably knows that, I guess, for the musicians. And I always thought it was harmonic 2. Well, it turns out it was harmonic 4, not important. But so Olaf played harmonic 4 for me, and I thought, just knowing from other string instruments I've worked with, or other instruments I've worked with, that there are other harmonics that are possible with almost every other instrument. So I asked Olaf, well, can we try other harmonics? And I think you said something like, no, but let's try. But let's try, right? So he's like, well, let's try. So what we did was try putting the finger at different locations and striking it, and then lo and behold, he found this harmonic that changed with the different bars, and it's basically around between 10 and 15. But they're non-harmonic partials because they also change over time. So you hit the bar once, and you get this high tone, and then after like a 0.5 of a second, it kind of phases into something else. And it's very strange, and we found that just through trying things.
Yeah, and then later on we did some research, and I was doing it on different instruments and trying to figure out, and then it's not at 100%. In different instruments we have slightly different results. Some notes are not responding due to manufacturing things or whatever. But basically we can reproduce it on all the instruments, for example. So.
Yeah, again, that's similar to what we do in big science projects like ESS. And we have a series of measurements we know we want to make, a series of studies we want to do in terms of materials and chemistry and whatnot. And so we can predict to some extent, because we know the theory and we know, what we're trying to accomplish, what some of the outcomes will be. And that's all very good, and that will advance science and it will advance things. But where it really gets interesting is when we develop a new instrument like ESS with new capabilities and we discover something we weren't expecting. And this is sort of analogous to this. And that's when you get really fundamental changes in science, and you can make fundamental changes in the way we view the world, where you develop a capacity, and then you use that capacity to examine things, and that can lead to unexpected discoveries, which are by far generally the most interesting ones. So it's very similar to this.
Yeah, I mean, along with Karin's question, I think in a way, often when you have the art-science connection, almost always it's the artist who's influenced by the scientist. But there are some examples of scientists also being influenced by artists. Have you ran into that in your work at all? Or?
I haven't done it directly, but I do know that happens. I mean, there are first off, while I am totally incompetent in music and musical composition, there are many scientists who actually are quite good at it, because mathematics plays a role, of course, in both music and science. So there are many scientists who, as a hobby or as an avocation, are either play music or compose music. But being able to look at something in a slightly different way, and that's where we're collaborating with arts comes from, is always a valuable thing. So now when I think about superfluid helium, I will include in my sort of intellectual landscape the fact that it could inspire certain things in music. Yeah. And it may well be that later on that will cause me to think about it in a slightly different way and allow me to do other things. And again, it's one of these things that you can't really predict, but we know that if you do these sorts of collaborations, that you get this sort of synergy, and they can lead to very interesting results. And so that's why ESS is supportive of this, and Lund University is supportive of this, because it really gives you sort of the, if you will, the churn of intellectual of interest that leads to interesting things, both in the arts and in the sciences.
And one thing we're trying to do is we're trying to set up a situation in which this is only the first step. We have discussions and we have external funding for a student in residence at ESS. Right. And we're a little bit slow on that with COVID, naturally, because now they're just getting around to opening next year.
Right.
Yeah. So, but this is something that will be open to perhaps even all students at Lund.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not only us, and I think that's a very exciting thing, because it's inspirational, and it also can be operational as well.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always helpful to have new people come in. It's helpful to, the very fact that if a scientist at ESS is explaining his science to, say, a music student or to an art student, he's got to understand he's got to understand his field well enough to be able to do that without dropping in the jargon or dropping in the mathematics. And in the process of doing that, he develops a deeper understanding of his field, and then the feedback he gets from the students generally is also very interesting and useful to that person. And so the interaction is what's important, and it, as I said, it helps us in recruiting staff, because we put them into an environment where they'll do a lot of very different, interesting things and engage with people in other disciplines. And that's generally something that people look for in these sorts of institutions. And you can see this. CERN has had a visiting artists program for many, many years. Most of the national laboratories in the US have some function, some sort of this thing. And so we're very excited to be starting that here at ESS.
Very exciting.
Yeah, I think it's... do I need to talk in the microphone?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. I think it's really an underdeveloped area, this connection and the field between the arts and more technically oriented sciences. Because I think we are more similar in many respects than what we know, even.
Yeah.
And in the perspective that we, especially in the creative arts, where you have to invent the knowledge and the tools at the same time as you investigate or search for them. That's it's not like that in all sciences. I mean, many are more using the factors that are already there, but we have to invent them at the same time.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, even for performers, this aspect of creativity and imagination is so important. Even if you're not composing, interpreting a piece really requires to have imagination. And I think that this is something that I think you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it is a good scientist.
No, you have to have. I mean, one of the key requirements to being a good scientist really is curiosity about the world and having an imagination to look at it in a slightly different way, to ask what-if questions, to say, if I develop a certain instrument, what does that do? What can I measure with that? And what problem does that help solve? And so the same issues of creativity and innovation that you see in the arts also, of course, apply at scientific research laboratories such as ESS. And it's the same sort of personalities in a large extent that get drawn to both of these things. So there is, I think, we're a lot more similar than different. We're just working with different tools or different sets of paradigms. We're restricted in science with the laws of nature and the things we can do and things we can't do, but there's a tremendous amount of creativity within that can be done, and being creative and being curious is what leads to scientific development and discoveries and also technological developments that follow along. So it's very similar, I think.
Yeah, yeah. For me, it's interesting, the question of, okay, we're dealing with sound in music, of course, and maybe for the visual arts, it's more. It's easier to see the connection between the work that might happen at ESS and the people who are dealing with vision. But audition, sound, the frequency range that you're dealing with at ESS is so incredibly higher than what we deal with as in our hearing range. Like 20,000 is nothing for somebody who's Right. Now we use radio frequencies to put power into the beams. That's how we accelerate the beams. And those work at ESS, the frequencies are 352 megahertz and 704 megahertz. And these are chosen because the industry involved has that equipment in those ranges. And also those ranges make technical sense. But you say it's a much higher frequency than what you hear in sound. But still, things like Fourier analysis and understanding how waveforms work and the sorts of things that you learn in musical theory and in composition and in performance, that sort of tool set is also used in our facility as well. And I think what's interesting here is we're taking something in helium that's not generally considered a sound medium. I mean, we do have second sound in helium-2, but it's a very unique property of helium-2 itself. We do, of course, transmit sound through helium, but that's not a real area in which we work in. And it's very interesting, I think, to start to look at that sort of activity with this collaboration. Right. Wonderful videos on YouTube as well.
Yes.
Regarding second sound. Yeah.
Could I ask? I would like to ask you, how did you experience working with this piece? In this perspective, did it expand your knowledge in these areas?
I mean, he's focusing very much in his piece. Since we started from scratch in the beginning, so we just met, and then he was asking some questions. I was pulling out some instruments, and then we tried with these instruments to figure out which sounds are possible, which kind of trafficking on the instrument would be useful for him. We made some videos and we just explored the material in a way. And from there on, for me, this is a very, very normal process in dealing with the instruments, because often the composer, they don't know so much my instruments, because these are my instruments, I know them, and they are more theoretical. And then he developed the idea of the piece and was putting it together, and then in between there were some questions and some little video chats and talking again if that's possible or not, and then he wrote it down. Then some sketches where I said, no, that's not a good way to put it down, because then everybody will be confused and we don't get the right result out. Then he changed, and so on the way to this product, we let's call it product, it's not, but we've been working a lot together in different steps, and then the last steps now were here. It was scheduled before that he would come to Bremen once again with the final score so that we can go through it and work details out, and due to Corona that was not possible, and so we spent some time here, or quite a lot of time, in working again on that piece and to see whether it was good, how we can increase the effect, how we can make it better and come to a better result.
I have to say that the process between he and I had almost nothing to do with these kind of issues. Making art or making music using unusual procedures is time-consuming, and it's difficult sometimes if you're kind of pushing the envelope. So, but this is the normal process. So I think this is what everybody here who's dealing with creative arts understands. So there's nothing unusual about that process at all.
No,
it's a normal process.
not at all.
Yeah.
And it's also the question of who has which role in this process. So I mean, I'm providing the knowledge what I have about the instruments, and I'm sharing that with him, but I don't interfere in the compositional process because I consider him to be the expert in this, and so if he's asking a question, I might say something, or if at some point I'm not totally agreeing, maybe I say something. But basically, I think I have my role, he has his role, and so we do the research, and then he's writing what he's writing, whatever that is, and later on we look at it together and decide whether that's practical, whether we can use it, whether we can play this, or whether we have to change because of some other reasons. And so then we come back to the practical aspect, and we talk a little bit of the overall form or something, but finally I consider this the work of the composer.
Sure, yeah. And just for this particular project, I mean, this guy is a master musician. He might not look like it, but he's really one of the world's best. This guy's an amazing percussionist, truly. So we're lucky to have him here. So it was a pleasure to work with this guy. He's real good. You know, they were playing a piece on Wednesday. I don't know, a few people were there. They did a piece for 4 people on snare drums. And all 4 people were playing the snare, doing a roll. You know what a roll is, huh? Everybody knows this. Just to see this guy play something, the most basic technique, was you could immediately tell, oh my God, like when you do a roll, right? It's going, it's like his hands weren't even moving. Like everybody else is moving a little bit, and they're all really good players in the ensemble, right? But this guy, he was like this. I was like, what the hell? What's wrong with this guy? He doesn't move at all. It was incredible, and the sound was amazing, right, Shin? Right? Yeah. It was amazing, this guy. So for me, it's a big pleasure that not only that we can explore new ground, set up frameworks for the future, and for me, it's very exciting, this work with John, and then to be able to apply it with a guy who's really great is a big benefit. I mean, I consider myself very lucky. So thank you. You both.
Thank you, Wolf. I feel the same way. I'm very fortunate to be involved in this project, and it's been, it's always interesting to learn new things, and I've certainly learned a lot in this, and hopefully I've contributed some as well. So I'm consider myself very fortunate as well.
Are there any questions?
I have one more before. Yes, I just think is often when you talk to composers, they say that when you work with a piece, then you have a question or some kind of issue or a problem or whatever you call it. And then the result of a piece is not so often that you get a kind of solution of this problem, but more like it provides you with new questions. And maybe this is not, there isn't a final state. But that is the starting point for something new. So, what would you say in respect, in this respect? Has this project created a new issue, or what would that be then? What do you say?
For me, not specific issues, but it's opening a door to new possibilities. Is the way I look at it. Because it's both from the science aspect, because it's really an influence of the sciences. I'm not at all doing science. It's clearly an influence.
Right.
And we've talked about some future projects and ideas of doing things at ESS that might involve electronics and other ways of gathering information put into our artistic realm. And then with what we did, it's going to the edge in some respects, and pulling back a little bit, because we're dealing with 4 people coordinating themselves on multiple instruments, and so things have to be very practical as well. Unless you want things just to be loose, and we didn't want that at all. So for me, it's not necessarily something new, except for the specifics that we're dealing with the different instruments, like scraping a cymbal to get sustained vibrations. It's pretty cool. Any questions from the audience? Comments, questions? I can't see, so just yell if you have anything. No? Do you know what time it is?
5 minutes to set.
5 minutes to set. Okay, so thank you for coming. If there are no questions, comments? Okay. Thank you for coming, and we have a concert beginning in a few minutes, and enjoy. We'll take a few minutes break, and if anybody wants to get a coffee or a wine or something, we'll start in a few minutes. So thank you. Thanks.